Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial today I'd like to share with you my Icicle drop earring design. Now I've already made one. We'll look at that a little bit more closely on the board in just a second. I'd like to share with you how to make the matching pair. This is the earring that we're going to make together today. I've chosen to work with some beautiful and quite different glistening, glittery, sparkling, monochrome beads from Jessie James Beads Colour Trends collection called Crystal Cave. Now I do like a little bit of sparkle. Obviously you don't have to use exactly the same beads, but it's really cool to have this very, very highly textured bent disc which adds a little bit of dynamism to the design, and then the beads that are stacked on the main post of the body of the earring are descending in order, but they're quite varied. I've got a rhinestone set small filigree spacer down at the bottom, a couple of crystal rondelles in different sizes and colourways, and then I've got this beautiful globe of almost joined circles, I suppose, up at the top. And then down at the bottom, freely mobile, I've got one of these gorgeous spike or dagger beads. Now these all, as I say, come from the Crystal Cave blend, and these are the beads that I've chosen to work with today. Let's just pop those out on the board very, very quickly to have a look at what we're going to work with, and then we'll move on to a very simple technique. So that's what we're going to work with. The main key of this design is that I've chosen to start large at the top and move down to small at the bottom. And then we've got that mobile dagger bead or spike bead down at the base. So let's just clear the boards and we will get creating. I'll pop that one up in the corner. And then we'll just slide the beads ready to be used. Tell you what, why don't we just pop them back in the pot? That seems the most sensible thing to do. So I'm using 2 gauges of wire today. They're both round silver plated in a medium temper or a German style. And the tools I'm going to be using are bent chain nose pliers, semi-flush cutters, round nose pliers, a second pair optionally of chain nose pliers, always handy to have, and a round form that's just slightly larger than this highly textured disc bead, which I really, really like. So I'm using a marker pen. You probably know which one it is, but there we go. Let's pop that over to the side. So I have around about 12 inches or so of that 18 gauge round wire. And the first thing that I'm going to do, as ever, is give that a lovely warm through. So if I grab a hold of one end, we're going to work from the one end. So you don't have to warm the whole length of wire in one go if you don't want to. Absolutely not a problem. Now this is more wire than we need, but I do always prefer to have just a little bit extra. Now that's nice and fluid. I've made a tiny mark on the end, so I'm just going to trim that very end section away. One of the reasons I tend to start with more wire than I need. So what I'm going to do is come a couple of inches from the end, probably around about 3 inches. Nice flush cut on the end there. I'm going to turn a right angle, and then I'm going to grab in my round form. Now most ring mandrels don't go quite small enough for what you need. So what you can do is either use the end of your ring mandrel and then make it ever so slightly smaller, or find yourself a pen or a piece of wooden dowel or similar. And I'm just going to take that tail of nicely warmed wire all the way around to create a nice circular form. Now my marker pen is in fact a little bit larger than I need, so you might want to size that down slightly. If you don't have the exactly correct size that you want, you can make a general round form and then just gently coerce that to become slightly smaller by making teeny tiny adjustments in that circular form until you get a roundish form that is around about the size that you need, so a little bit larger than your disc spacer if you're going to be using that. What you don't want to have is too small a circular form, because your dagger bead or spike bead, whatever you want to know it as, doesn't particularly want to be too stressed out. So we're just going to allow that to circle nicely and gently around so that it sits down at the base of the design like so. The next thing we're going to do is tie a knot in it, so to speak. So I'm just going to open that out ever so slightly. I think I made it just a little bit too small. And what I'm going to do is to support the short tail of wire as it goes across that first angle that we made. I'm going to pinch that very firmly with the tip of my pliers and just bring that tail all the way back around, and I'm going to keep supporting that whilst I make the first there you go, the first circle around that core wire. Now the reason I keep quite a good grip on that is because I don't want this circle to get any smaller. I want to set that size. You can tighten up this little loop that you've made just by giving that a bit of a squish and a squeeze if you wish to. So I don't want too much going on here. I might take that tail of wire around for a second turn, maybe even a third, dependent on how long you want your earrings to be. So I've actually ended up going around 3 times. Let's trim that wire away. You can see that there's just a tiny bit of sticking up wire. If I rotate that in the light, you'll see that that's just slightly elevated, because this is going to be worn potentially with fine scarves or your hair down perhaps. We don't want that to catch on anything, so I'm just going to give that a little nip in with those beautiful, helpful bent chain nose pliers. And what I'm doing is I'm rotating them around carefully, so I'm not tightening up this coil that we've made. I'm just smoothing down that end so that it sits nice and neatly. The next thing that we're going to do is load on the beads to the far end. So let's draw all the wire along. As I said before, far more wire than I actually need, but I'd rather get caught with extra than caught too short. So with this filigree rhinestone encrusted spacer bead, there is a section through which you can pass your beading material. It's not a free-for-all. So once you've found that, we're then going to graduate up through the sizes. As I mentioned earlier, you can use any crystal collection that you like. I just happen to really enjoy the fact that this one's slightly opalescent, this is completely clear, and this one's got that half silver coating. They're all rondelles, but this one at the top is slightly chubbier than the rest, so you've got 3 different finishes, and I really like that. We're now going to add in the beautiful, very, very open, almost like circles. Now you may find multiple access points on this. Just find some that match up so that you can go through the centre, and as it spins around you can see that that is pretty central. If you're using a different bead, then all well and good, it doesn't really matter. If that's not completely centralised, you can take that off and try a different aperture until that sits perfectly for you. Now what I'm going to do is allow all of those beads to sit down above the loop that we've created. Now if you're new to a process like this, one of the hints that I can give you, which I found really helpful when I discovered it, is that you don't have to make this wrapped loop up at the top just yet. What you can do is just apply a little bit of heat and warmth up towards the end here, and what I'm going to do is turn a little loop on the end like so, and that's going to act as a bead stopper. That gives me all of my options about what I do with the rest of this wire later on, just leaves them open, because when I start the next section of today's tutorial, I'm going to want a little bit of flexibility on where these beads sit on this central core. And if I make that wrapped loop up at the top now and I make it nice and tight, that's all well and good, it will look beautiful, but I might actually want to change my mind about how many times I rotate the secondary wire around. Maybe I will want these to open up, so give yourself some options by creating a bead stopper. So the base technique of today's tutorial is really simple and really adaptable. You can totally change how you use this. You can invert the bead order, you can play around with the distances, you can change the shape. Instead of having a circle with a dagger bead down at the base, you could have a triangular form or a square form. You could add on some little heshy beads. There's 1,000,001 different combinations for a basic stacked earring on a central core with a secondary wire. So I'm going to take you through my Icicle earrings now, and I hope that you enjoy them, but don't forget that you can change it up endlessly. Now, I made a slight error on the first part of my tutorial in so much as I wrapped 3 times around the core wire. just noticed I only wrapped once around on the first example. So I've just done a very quick remake, making that round form and then creating just a single loop down at the base. In that way, my earrings are much more likely to match each other. If you're making this as an icicle drop pendant instead, really doesn't matter. But if you're making them as earrings, you will probably want to do a better job than I did and get those to be equal. Now, the second wire that we're going to add in today is a length of 20 gauge or 0.8mm. This again is round copper, silver plated in a medium temper. I'm just going to give that a quick warm just to make sure that that's nice and fluid. It's about 12 inches again, and around about 1 inch from the end I'm going to make a really sharp hairpin like bend, and we're going to add in this little spangly stardust washer spacer, I want to say. I'm just going to loop the hole through there and then sit that down at the base. So what we're looking for is to have the circle form sitting right. You might need to just open that out and then close it back up again when you get it there. We're looking for that circular form to sit right down at the bottom of that hairpin bend that we made. What we're going to do now is to fold the short end of wire backwards across the long end of wire. So if I just grip a hold of that with my pliers, give that a push over, you can see we're just taking that down, sharp bend, back up, and then back across itself. What I want to do now is something that's not very fussy at all. I just want to bring that tail back around on itself, fold it until it meets. So you've literally just got one pass of wire, much like I rejigged down at the bottom here. We want to keep it quite simple and quite small. So I'm just going to trim away that excess now, pop that in the scrap pot, and just make sure there's no sticky uppy parts. Might take a little bit of a second to switch that around so I can squish it down neatly without bending it. We just want that to be nice and neat and tidy and not rough, so it's not going to catch on anything. Now I am going to put some extra fluidity in the wire now by running that between thumb and forefinger. And what we're going to do is assess which is the best angle of view for my earrings. Sometimes you'll be able to see the cut end of the wire, as you can just there if you look very, very closely. If you flip that in the opposite direction, this is a slightly neater view. So when I'm making earrings and pendants, I try to make them as universally visible as possible, but just sometimes there might be a slightly more attractive orientation. So if I just flip this around for a second, this is the front of my earring. What I want to do, again, just making sure that this is nice and fluid, check which is the front view for my little spangly spacer bead, and I'm going to push that from the rear side so that it sits over the top of that dagger bead, and just hold it like so. Now this might pop out of my control, it can be a little bit fiddly, it's not difficult, it just doesn't want to sit there and be photographed or videoed. So once I've got that little spangly, sparkly, textured spacer sitting over the top of that gorgeous dagger bead, I'm going to pinch that very, very firmly into position and draw it once around that circular form at the top. And we're going to use my Rings of Galatea, Rings of, I want to say Neptune, but I'm not very good on the planets, I can't remember which one it was now. And one bead at a time, I'm going to encircle. So because my finer gauge wire, that 20 gauge or 0.8mm, is starting over the top of the core wire, I want it to travel around the side of the bead to underneath. So I'm going to draw that back across the core again, so you get this almost helter-skelter-like effect, and I'm going to drop the next bead in. Now with the earring I have already made, these are very, very tightly packed against each other, so the wire sits on top of where those beads touch. If you want to replicate that, you'll need to push the beads against each other as you bring that wire around so that they look the same. If you're making pendants independently of each other, then it's less important. Another way you can achieve this is to do your wrapped loop before you start this part of the process, and in that way the wire cannot sit between the beads because there's no space. I, however, always like to have the option of all this spare wire so that I can change my mind on how things look later on. What I might do for you today is make some asymmetric earrings, perhaps repurpose them as icicle pendants instead. So because I've left this with no tension, this gives me the option to change up how this process works. I will just show you again what you would need to do if you wanted to replicate this exact design. You push the beads together as you bring that wire around so it can't escape between them. A different variation is to have multiple twists and turns. So let's go for 3 wraps around that core wire, and I'll bring my next bead down into position. So again, that finer wire is sitting over the top of the core. I'm going to hold the bead in position. That finer gauge wire travels around the outside of the bead to underneath the core wire. And I'm going to hit the camera, and then I'm going to bring the wire around 3 times. Another thing that you can do with a design like this is alter the number of times you're spinning around the core. So although in my sample I did my wrapped loop up at the top first, so I had tension, all the beads were squished against each other, and that means that the wire sits around where the beads meet. With this one, I've got lots of different choices because I left it all loose and open at the top. So what I might do is go for 3 wraps between bead number 1 and bead number 2, and then I might up it, and let's have a look and see what that looks like at the end. So I've gone for 4 wraps between bead 2 and bead 3. So again, the finer wire is coming over the top of the core wire. Warm that through subtly, push the bead into position and support it, draw that wire around the outside of the bead and underneath the core. So I'm going to go now for 5 wraps around that core wire, and this is why we're using 0.8mm or 20 gauge, sorry about the scratching on the surface, instead of another piece of that heavier 1mm gauge. Now you can see there's a tiny gap in my wire stack here, so I just want to tighten that up before I go any further. Always being super careful of the beads themselves, just tighten that up slightly, and I'll push the next bead down into position. So I think I might have enough wire here to do the elongated stacking. So we've got 3 wraps, 4 wraps, 5 wraps. Let's take the wire around the outside of that bead again, hold the bead into position. Wire travels from on top of the core to underneath the core. Let's wrap a whole bunch of times and also move the work surface around. So that's 2, that's 3, that's 4, that's 5. I think we need another one. 6, and then push the final bead into position, and you can see they're very much not a pair now, but that's fine. I'll repurpose them as icicle drop pendants instead. And then what we're going to do is allow that wire to just sit around for a moment whilst we put our wrapped loop in at the top. Now we've got plenty of spare wire. We did start with an extended amount. Let's just open this wire out for a second. So I have down here at the bottom of your screen is the lighter gauge wire, and I'm just going to allow that to sit for a second whilst I add in my next wrapped loop up at the top here. And what I want to do is have a wrapped loop made with the heavier 1mm gauge core wire. So I'm going to estimate where 7 wraps of the fine wire is going to take me, because what we're going to do is to create a wrapped loop up at the top first. So we're using that core wire, round nose pliers to create that round form, draw that wire all the way around, nice strong, doesn't have to be massive because you're using earring findings. If you were making this as a pendant, you would probably want to orient it through 90 degrees instead. I'm going to make it as an earring and just wear them as asymmetric ones, I think. So we've got our round form, and then I'm going to fill the gap. So let's just take the lighter wire out of the way for a second, bring that heavier wire around, try to control it as much as you can. When you're trying to show it to a camera without hitting the camera, which is something I do all the time anyway, and we're looking to generate tension, fill all the way so that the bead stays static. I'm just going to trim that just a little way past the end then, and we've got a good 4-inch cut of wire there. So we had more than enough. What I want to do is make sure that that tail doesn't stick up and catch, so let's give that a nice smoothing down. It's done quite a lot of work, so it's a little bit tense. And if I flip this back round into the original orientation, what I'm aiming to do now is to cover over the top of the circular wrapping that we just made Again, finer gauge wire is coming over the top of the core. Get that nice and warm and fluid. You really need to put some intention into it. Nice and warm and fluid, and it then travels to underneath the core wire like so. Grip that firmly as you make those final few turns, strengthening that section up at the top. And if the gods of jewellery making are with us, we've got 7 wraps, 6, 5, 4 and 3, so that you have an increase in distance between the beads. So you can play with sizes, with forms, with shapes, with how dynamic things can be caused to look. With you've got a round form, you've got a very angular form, you've got some very soft swooshing forms. We've changed the type of the bead as we go, so we have hollow, we've got crystals with different colourways, and then we've got rhinestone sparkle down at the bottom. So up at the back of the design at the top, we're looking to trim away that last little bit of that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire. And again, make sure that that sits down nice and neat and safely. Squish, like so. So I actually think I probably would wear these as asymmetric earrings. Let's just put the 2 design types down. And all I've gone for is a very, very simple modified head pin style earring finding. So let's just loop that in. That's the front, isn't it? Yep. So let's just pop that in, close that back up neatly and give it a tiny squish for strength. 2 very different feeling earrings. Maybe you don't want to wear asymmetric, that's fine. I would probably repurpose that as a drop pendant, but I don't know, maybe I'll be dangerous and daring and wear asymmetric for once. So you have the same technique making 2 different earrings. You could go for asymmetric, or you could just recreate the same design twice. I have used the beautiful Crystal Cave collection from my friends at Jessie James Beads to create my Icicle drop earrings, but you can use really any bead collection that you like, or even if you can find pairs in your bead stash, go for that. I really, really like these actually. I think I might wear them out tonight. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you back again very, very soon on the Gem Hawks YouTube channel. Bye for now.